Part 2 for the video lecture on deviance. This was the slide that you last saw. We were talking about deviance and deviant groups. So we've made, painstakingly, I've made the distinction between deviance and with a CE on the end of it, and deviance, or deviant groups. Okay? Now, how does society attempt to regulate deviance? Well, social control. Attempts by society to regulate the thoughts and the behaviors of individuals, or the ways in which a society attempts to prevent deviance and punish the deviants. Okay? So every society attempts to exert some measure of social control to prevent, or at least to limit, deviance. And we'll talk a little bit about that at this point. Now, less threatening forms of deviance are controlled through the everyday interactions of individuals, of people. For example, parents attempting to keep their children from dyeing their hair. Think about yourselves. I bet there have been times where you've wanted to do something fairly radical in terms of your appearance. Maybe get a piercing, maybe get a tattoo, and your parents are not real keen on the idea. They're not real excited about it. They're not going to call the police. I mean, you're not going to go to prison. Law enforcement people aren't going to get involved with that. That's considered a less threatening form of deviance. So your parents are going to attempt to control that. Another example, teacher trying to quiet down disruptive students. I'm not going to call the police if I can't get my kids to quiet down. I'm going to try to intervene myself, because that's a less threatening form of deviance when you compare it to like murder and assault and other forms of deviance. I remember my grandmother trying to convince me to cut my rat tail in 1984. If you're not familiar with the rat tail, it was a popular hairstyle, sort of kind of, for young boys, where you'd have short hair all around, but you'd have like 5 strands of hair in the back that would grow down, and it looked literally like a rat tail. And I remember her trying to not call the police to prevent me from continuing in this deviance, but she would try to do it herself. She would try to cut it off, and then she made me stuff it down my shirt for church because she was embarrassed to have me seen like that in public. Now, more threatening forms of deviance are controlled by the institutions of social control, the formal institutions of social control within our society. So, for example, if after class, if we're meeting in a classroom, and I follow you home, and I break into your house, and I take all your stuff, I steal it, and you find out about it, it's not going to be like in the previous slide, where maybe your parents say, "Now, Mr. Dean, you shouldn't do that. We're going to slap you on the wrist, and don't do that anymore." No, because this is a more serious form of deviance. The police are likely going to get involved with that. The criminal justice system, the court system, is probably going to get involved in something like that because it's a more serious form of deviance. Another example, attempting to commit suicide. As a psychologist, which is what I do, during the day, I'm working as a prison psychologist. If someone attempts or threatens suicide, I can't just say, "Well, don't do that. Don't think about that anymore. That's really bad. You could really hurt yourself." That's a more serious form of deviance that involves and invokes institutions of social control, such as mental health facilities. Someone can be committed against their will if they're posing a threat to themselves or others. Another example, a prisoner assaults a correctional officer. They're not just going to get a slap on the wrist, from a parent or from the warden. Probably the prison system is going to lock them down. They could get outside charges for assaulting an officer, for another person. So more serious forms of deviance are controlled that way. Now, in Chapter 8, with deviance, we talk about manifest functions and latent functions, as well as dysfunction. From the functionalist perspective, if you remember the structural functionalist, the functional structuralist approach, it looks at society as being composed of different parts. Functionalism says society is like a machine or an organism. If one part's not working well, everything else kind of doesn't function either. Now, kind of keep that in mind for a second, especially when we talk about dysfunction. Manifest functions are intended functions of an institution. When we talk about a social institution, we're talking about religion, or, for example, public education, or, for example, the family. The family has very specific functions for society, intended functions. Some manifest functions of family include raising children. Another manifest function of family is to provide financially and psychologically, emotionally for children. To teach socialization. Families are supposed to teach children lessons about life. Latent functions, on the other hand, are the unintended functions of an institution. They're not necessarily negative. And I can give you an example of a latent function. I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide here. We'll go to the prisons and the jails. We'll go back up to a manifest function. Again, a manifest is an intended function. The job of prisons and jails are to punish, to rehabilitate, and to deter. In other words, to keep people from wanting to commit crimes, because they should be afraid that they'll go to prison or jail. Those are the intended functions, but people still go to jail. They still commit crimes. Now, the latent functions of prisons is that they end up, not on purpose, but they end up being babysitting services for juveniles a lot of times, and for adults. Road crew work. Inmates are given the option to, instead of sitting in a cell all day, to get out, move around, and they can work on road crews, and that provides free labor for the state. That's not the intended function of prison, but it's kind of a nice side benefit, if you will. Now, dysfunction are unintended and negative consequences of an institution. The word within, I don't know why that's in there, just ignore that. But again, unintended and negative consequences of an institution. So let me come back to the slide we were just on. So a dysfunction of prison is this. It makes criminals more hardcore. It makes them better criminals. Prisons and jails can actually make inmates more defiant to authority than they were in the first place. Now, we don't want this to happen. These are not good things. I'll tell you how it happens. I've been working in prisons for almost 20 years. And one of the first things that you see, that I see, when inmates come into a prison and they're all coming through the intake process, they all sit in what's called a pod. There's maybe 20, 30, 40 of them sitting together, and they're talking, they're conversing. And they get to talking about their crimes. And, what are you here for? Well, I did this. Well, what are you here for? Well, I did this. Invariably, they start critiquing each other's criminal method. And you'll hear things like, oh, well, here's how you could do this better next time. Yeah, you broke into this house, you got caught. Here's what you need to do. And they start swapping notes. And actually, they become better criminals. They're educating each other on how to be better criminals when they get out. So that's definitely not a manifest function of prison, but it happens. Another example of an institution are schools, public school. The manifest function, again, we're talking about the intended functions of an institution. The manifest function of schools are to educate, to discipline, and to socialize. Latent functions of schools, sometimes like prisons and jails, they end up being babysitting services. Parents just want to keep their kids in school. They don't really care how they're doing necessarily sometimes, but they get to work. They don't have to worry about their kids. They put their kids in these after-school programs so they don't have to deal with them after work. But really, for most adults, it allows them to work. Because if you have young children and there are no schools, who's going to care for kids? School is free. So it's a free babysitting service. Now, a dysfunction of public schools, sometimes poor socialization. If kids get into a school system with negative peers or bad peer groups, they could learn very bad habits. They could adopt very negative lifestyles, which will impact them negatively throughout their life course. Now, we also can talk about sanctions. We can talk about positive and negative sanctions for adhering to or violating norms. When we violate norms of society, in other words, when we engage in deviance, often we incur what's called a negative sanction. Okay, a negative sanction is a punishment. Remember, a positive sanction is a reward for doing something. For example, if I hold the door for a lady, my grandmother always told me, Brandon, hold the door for a lady. And I still do that to this day because I was taught that. A lot of times when I hold the door for a lady, I get a positive sanction. I get a thank you. I get some kind of a little reward or a pat on the back. Now, a negative sanction, on the other hand, is a punishment for violating a cultural norm. Now, throughout society, we have had, at times, strong consensus. And consensus, by definition, is the extent of agreement on a given topic. Okay? Depending on what time we look at in U.S. history, some things have been weakly sanctioned, and we're down here I'm talking about negative sanctions, punishments, okay? Have been strongly or weakly sanctioned. And there's some social issues where we have agreed a lot or agreed a little bit or not at all. For example, prostitution. I'll give you an example of prostitution. Today in our society, we have a very weak consensus or level of agreement. When you ask people in society, should prostitution remain illegal? Half of people that you ask will say, yeah, it probably should still be illegal. The other half of people you ask will say, well, no, who's it really hurting? If two legally consenting of age adults or more consent and swap money for services, what's the big deal? So we have a weak consensus. We don't agree on it. However, it's still strongly sanctioned. It's illegal. If you're caught engaging in prostitution, you go to prison or jail. So that's kind of how that works. Abortion, for example. If you go back to before 1973, before Roe versus Wade, there was a pretty strong consensus about abortion in our country. Most people agreed within our country that abortion was always wrong or almost always wrong. Now, after Roe versus Wade, which reversed the illegality of abortion under specific circumstances, when you ask people today, again, it's a divided issue. Today, there's a very weak consensus about abortion. Some people feel that it's okay. A lot of people feel that it's not okay. And you have people waffling in the middle as well. And it is weakly sanctioned. You don't go to prison for having an abortion. It is legal in most situations. So we can kind of go back and forth with this idea of what we punish and how much we agree about what is deviance or what is not deviance. I'm going to direct your attention, I hope this comes out clearly, in your book. If you have your textbook, it's on page, if you have the most recent edition, on page 204, 205, Merton's strain theory. This is a classic theory of deviance, and I'm going to go ahead and just preface it here. I'll go ahead and stop the video because I'm going to run out of time on this video. But find that in your textbook if you have it. You can kind of follow along a little bit. We'll call that the end of part 2 of this video lecture.